In Isaiah chapter 5, Isaiah will write concerning Jerusalem, "Now I will sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill." He will begin speaking here, talking about the inhabitants of that land. We'll notice that in verse 3, speaking of the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the men of Judah. That God had done all of this work, cultivated this vineyard for them. Notice what all He did for them in verse 2. "And He fenced it, and He gathered out the stones thereof, and planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it, and also made a winepress therein." But notice when He did all of this work for Jerusalem there, for the inhabitants, He took all this care and work, but notice, and He looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. He had set them up for success, yet they had fallen away. Notice in verse 4, he says, what could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done in it? God is simply asking through Isaiah, I have done all of this great work for you. What more could I have done? I have taken such good care of you, yet you have fallen away. Noticing there as we continue in verse 4 that He thought it would bring forth grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. Now in verse 5 we notice He said, "I will take away the hedge thereof." For their evil deeds, God now has taken away this hedge around Jerusalem. But why would He do such a thing? Let's notice as we continue through chapter 5, there's going to be 6 woes that will be pronounced upon Judah and Jerusalem. Now these woes were a sign of the judgment, the extreme judgment that was about to become upon them. Notice with me in verse 8, "Woe unto them." Now the sin here is covetousness. They had committed that. That is one woe. We go to verse 11 for the second. "Woe unto them." They had committed debauchery. Continue on in verse 18. Woe unto them for their unbelief. We find in verse 20, "Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil. They had corrupted the truth." In verse 22, "Woe unto them, for they had corrupted justice." And verse 21 is the verse that we want to look at for our text this morning. "Woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes, and prudent in their own sight." Friends, this morning as we look at that, notice they had that arrogancy about them, that they thought that they had it all figured out. They were wise in their own eyes. Now, when we look at this, the self-deceivedness of these individuals, they had set the standard for wisdom with that of themselves. They had looked around the inhabitants of that land and decided that these were the people that were smart, is the ones that we have around about us today in this area. And how often is it the case in the world today that that's what they say is wise man by the one compared to around that individual? In the world today, they'll say, well, you have to be an evolutionist. You must believe in evolutionists if you're wise. Then the circular reasoning is, well, why should I do that? And they say, well, because people that are wise believe in evolution. So if you want to be wise, you believe in evolution because that's what the wise people do. And you say, well, if you were to believe in creation, you would simply be a simple-minded individual. But friends, this morning I understand I'm a simple boy from Tennessee, but it's easier for me to believe that God spoke everything into existence in 6 days than it is to believe that everything in this universe came about by a mere accident. A tornado did not go through Shelby County and produce the building that we are sitting in today. It had to have a designer. So if that makes me simple-minded, that's okay. But to the world, they say compared to other people in the world, we are wise because of this. Now, talking about Jerusalem and Judah, back in that day of Isaiah prophesying to them for their sins, but let's look a little further for a New Testament example of this, and let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, we'll begin there in verse 12. "For we dare not make ourselves of the number." Now, Paul's writing here for we, that's what he's talking about, those with him, we're not going to make ourselves of the number. And those of that number were the Judaizers that were in the area. And they were going to be trying to teach this false doctrine. Now notice what Paul says. He says, we do not make ourselves of the number or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves. He said, we're not of that group of individuals. They're walking around puffed up and prideful because they're wise in themselves. He said, we're not with those individuals. Listen how he describes them. Continuing in verse 12, but they measure themselves by themselves, and comparing themselves against themselves, and catch what Paul says, are not wise. These individuals had set the standard. They said, we know exactly what is right. We know exactly what we need to be doing. We are wise because we are comparing ourselves against ourselves. You see, they had set the standard by man and had left God completely out of that equation. They didn't think about what God had said. They just said, we're wise. We're comparing ourselves against ourselves, and we know everything that needs to be known. And again, we find that in the world today. The idea that you have to believe what we believe. There's a majority of people that believe that, and because the majority of people believe that, well, you have to follow along, right? Some people will even look at that and say, well, I don't really know why I believe that, but everybody else does, so I just default to saying, yeah, they're right. Because everyone around us may say that. But friends, I want you to notice in the world today that it seemingly is going out of control. We all know that. That the individuals that are making these rules and these legislations, they think, well, one day it's okay to do this, the next day it's not. Then they say, well, we've offended these people, now we have to change this. And because we changed it, now we've offended somebody else and we have to move on, and you keep moving farther and farther away. It's almost like I wish there was some line that was drawn. I wish there was some deciding factor, and we could say this is the left and this is the right, and now we know this baseline that we know is right, that we know is true. Well, friends, notice what Paul says in verse 13. He says, but we do not boast of things without our measure, or outside of our measure, but according to the measure of the rule which God hath distributed to us, a measure to reach even you. Paul is saying we didn't go outside of our bounds. We had a measure, we had a system there, a line, a rule that we went by. We went according to that. Now, friends, that word in the original language, rule, is canon. We think about the canonicity of the Bible. That rule that is set, that line that we so wish to desire to have, that says, yes, this is right, this is left, this is right, this down the middle is where we need to be. Friends, we have that. And in the world today, much like the inhabitants of Jerusalem, woe unto those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. They have exalted themselves because of the people that are around them. In Paul's day, these people in Corinth, they had exalted themselves the same way. And now we find ourselves in the world in today, this day and time, noticing that people have done the same thing. They've exalted themselves because they think they are the majority, and because they are the majority, then that makes it right. Well, friends, if you want to know what God says, if you want to know what it means to be wise, friends, we have that line. We have that rule today. We can go to God's Word and know exactly what we are to do. Never mind what the world may say. Never mind who may think they're wise in the world today. We have that line. We know that we have the truth, and we can stand behind that truth, and we can take assurance in that no matter what the world may say to us today. Thank you.